The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Raven's Hollow Castle, like secrets that refused to be told. Prince Alexander Thornwick stood at the towering window of his private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the royal gardens below. His reflection in the glass showed a man of 35 years, bearing the weight of a crown he had never wanted and the burden of a family legacy that threatened to crumble beneath scandal and betrayal. The heavy oak doors behind him creaked open, and his private secretary, Margaret Whitfield, entered with purposeful steps. Her usually composed demeanor carried an edge of urgency that made Alexander's stomach tighten with anticipation. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret began, her voice carefully measured. "I'm afraid there are developments regarding the succession matter that require your immediate attention." Alexander turned from the window, his steel blue eyes meeting Margaret's concerned gaze. For months, whispers had circulated through the palace corridors about his father, King Edmund's declining health, and the controversial influence of his second wife, Queen Consort Victoria Ashworth. What had once been palace gossip was now threatening to tear apart the very foundation of the monarchy. "What has she done now?" Alexander asked, though he already suspected the answer would be worse than he imagined. Margaret placed a leather portfolio on the mahogany desk between them. "Queen Victoria has been meeting secretly with Chancellor Blackwood and several key parliamentary members. Our sources suggest she's been discussing the possibility of King Edmund's abdication, with provisions that would bypass the traditional line of succession." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Victoria Ashworth had married his father 3 years ago, shortly after the tragic death of Alexander's beloved mother, Queen Isabella. What had initially appeared to be a marriage of companionship for a grieving widower had gradually revealed itself to be something far more calculated and dangerous. "She cannot seriously believe she can manipulate the succession laws," Alexander said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man accustomed to diplomatic restraint. "I'm afraid there's more, Your Highness," Margaret continued, opening the portfolio to reveal a series of photographs and documents. "These were taken by our security team during a surveillance operation. Queen Victoria has been in contact with foreign representatives, specifically from the Valderan Republic. The nature of these meetings appears to be financial and political in scope." Alexander studied the photographs, each image feeling like another nail in the coffin of his family's honor. There was Victoria, elegantly dressed as always, seated across from men he recognized as Valderan trade ministers and financial advisors. The Valderan Republic had been seeking favorable trade agreements with their kingdom for years, agreements that the Royal Council had consistently rejected due to concerns about economic exploitation. "This constitutes treason," Alexander whispered, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. "There's evidence suggesting she's promised them preferential treatment in exchange for financial backing for her political maneuvering," Margaret explained. "The payments appear to be substantial, routed through offshore accounts that she's been using to fund her influence campaign within Parliament." Alexander moved to his desk and sank into the leather chair that had belonged to kings for generations. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. His father, King Edmund, remained unaware of his wife's machinations, his health having deteriorated to the point where palace physicians had recommended he limit his official duties. "Where does my father stand in all of this?" Alexander asked, though he feared the answer. "King Edmund's condition has worsened considerably in recent weeks," Margaret replied with evident sadness. "The physicians believe the stress of recent events, combined with his ongoing grief over Queen Isabella's death, has accelerated his decline. Queen Victoria has been managing much of his correspondence and appointments, effectively controlling his access to information. The manipulation was more extensive than Alexander had imagined. Victoria wasn't merely seeking to influence the succession. She was systematically isolating his father and positioning herself as the power behind the throne. If she succeeded in her plans, she would effectively control the monarchy through whatever puppet ruler she managed to install. "What about my brother?" Alexander inquired, referring to his younger sibling, Prince James, who had always shown less interest in royal duties, preferring his military career to palace politics. Prince James remains stationed with his regiment in the Northern Territories, Margaret explained. However, there are indications that Queen Victoria has been attempting to contact him as well. We believe she may be offering him something in exchange for his support of her succession plans. Alexander's mind raced through the implications. James had always harbored some resentment about being the second son, despite Alexander's attempts to include him in royal responsibilities. If Victoria could convince James that he deserved the throne more than his older brother, she might succeed in splitting the royal family completely. We need to act quickly, Alexander decided, rising from his chair with renewed determination. First, I want a complete investigation into Victoria's financial dealings. Every transaction, every meeting, every communication needs to be documented and verified. Second, I need to speak with my father immediately, before Victoria can intercept or influence the conversation. Margaret nodded, already making notes in her ever-present leather journal. I've taken the liberty of arranging for a secure meeting with your father this afternoon. Victoria will be attending a charity luncheon in the capital, providing us with a window of opportunity. Good, Alexander replied, moving toward the window again to look out over the kingdom he was sworn to protect. And Margaret, I want you to contact Sir William Hartley immediately. If we're going to challenge Victoria's actions legally, I'll need the best legal mind in the kingdom. Sir William Hartley had served as the royal family's legal counsel for over 2 decades. His expertise in constitutional law and succession matters would be invaluable in navigating the complex legal challenges that lay ahead. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Your Highness, there's one more matter. The press has begun asking questions about the Queen Consort's recent activities. So far, we've managed to deflect their inquiries, but it's only a matter of time before this becomes public knowledge. Alexander nodded grimly. A public scandal would damage not only Victoria, but the entire royal family. The monarchy's reputation, already strained by various controversies over the years, might not survive another major crisis. Prepare a communications strategy, Alexander instructed. We need to control the narrative when this story breaks. The people deserve to know the truth. But it must be presented in a way that preserves the dignity of the crown and protects my father from unnecessary humiliation. After Margaret departed, Alexander remained alone in his study, contemplating the magnitude of the challenge before him. Victoria Ashworth had proven to be far more cunning and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Her ability to manipulate both personal relationships and political systems demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that demanded respect, even as it inspired fear. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room where generations of kings had made decisions that shaped the destiny of their nation. Alexander understood that the choices he made in the coming days would determine not only his own fate but the future of the monarchy itself. He thought of his mother, Queen Isabella, and the values she had instilled in him about duty, honor, and service to the people. She had always believed that the crown was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a burden to be carried with grace and humility. Victoria's actions represented everything Isabella had stood against: the use of power for personal gain, the manipulation of trust, and the betrayal of sacred duties. As the castle bells chimed the hour, Alexander steeled himself for the confrontation that lay ahead. The battle for the crown had begun, and he was determined to emerge victorious, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the kingdom and the people who depended on the monarchy's integrity. The war for Ravenshallow's throne would be fought not with swords and armies, but with evidence and legal maneuvering, political alliances, and public opinion. Alexander knew that victory would require him to match Victoria's cunning, while maintaining the moral high ground that distinguished a true king from a mere pretender to power. The shadows lengthened as evening approached, and Prince Alexander prepared to face the woman who threatened to destroy everything his family had built over centuries of service to the crown. The private dining room in the royal quarters felt unusually cold despite the crackling fire in the ornate marble fireplace. Prince Alexander sat across from his father, King Edmund, whose once commanding presence had been diminished by months of illness and grief. The king's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his teacup, and his eyes held a weariness that spoke of battles fought beyond the public eye. "Father," Alexander began carefully, "I need to discuss some concerning matters that have come to my attention regarding Victoria." King Edmund's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been relief crossing his weathered features. "I wondered when you would come to me about this," he said quietly. "I've been aware of Victoria's activities for some time now." The admission stunned Alexander. He had prepared for denial, anger, or disbelief, but not this calm acknowledgement of his wife's betrayal. "You've known?" Alexander asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Father, if you've been aware of her treasonous activities, why haven't you acted?" King Edmund set down his teacup with deliberate care, his movements betraying the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. "Because I've been gathering evidence of my own, son, and because I needed to be absolutely certain of her intentions before taking action that would irreversibly damage the crown." The king rose slowly from his chair and moved to an antique secretary desk that had belonged to his grandfather. From a hidden compartment, he withdrew a thick manila envelope and returned to the table. "Victoria believes she has been clever in hiding her activities," King Edmund continued, opening the envelope to reveal a collection of documents, photographs, and recorded communications. "What she doesn't realize is that the Royal Security Service has been monitoring her every move since shortly after our marriage." Alexander examined the materials his father had compiled. Bank records showed massive transfers from Valdoran accounts to offshore holdings under Victoria's control. Transcripts of recorded conversations revealed detailed discussions about bribing parliamentary members and manipulating succession laws. Most damning of all were photographs of Victoria meeting with known foreign agents in various discreet locations throughout the capital. "This evidence is more comprehensive than what my sources had uncovered," Alexander admitted. "But father, why have you allowed this charade to continue?" "Your health, the stress of maintaining this deception." "Because I needed her to fully reveal her hand," King Edmund interrupted, his voice gaining some of its old authority. "Victoria is not working alone in this conspiracy. There are others involved, both within our government and in foreign nations, who seek to destabilize our monarchy for their own purposes. By allowing her to proceed, I've been able to identify the full extent of the threat." The king opened another folder, revealing surveillance photographs of high-ranking officials Alexander recognized from Parliament and the Royal Council. Among them was Chancellor Blackwood, whose family had served the crown for generations, and several military commanders whose loyalty Alexander had never questioned. "The corruption runs deeper than either of us initially suspected," King Edmund explained. "Victoria's Valdoran connections are merely one aspect of a larger plot to transform our constitutional monarchy into something that serves foreign interests rather than our people." Alexander felt the foundation of everything he had believed about their government shifting beneath him. The betrayal wasn't limited to his stepmother's personal ambitions. It was a systematic assault on the very structure of their nation's independence. "What about James?" Alexander asked, remembering Margaret's concerns about his brother's potential involvement. King Edmund's expression darkened. "James has been approached, as we suspected. However, the communications we've intercepted suggest he's been feeding information back to our security services. Your brother may prefer military life to palace politics, but his loyalty to the crown has never wavered." Relief flooded through Alexander at this news. The prospect of fighting his own brother for the throne had been one of his greatest fears. "So what is our next move?" Alexander asked. "We have the evidence to expose Victoria and her conspirators, but the timing and manner of revelation will be crucial." King Edmund returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "That, my son, is where the situation becomes more complicated than simply presenting evidence to the authorities." The king paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "The Valdoran Republic has been planning a coordinated economic assault on our nation regardless of whether Victoria's political maneuvering succeeds. Their investment in her conspiracy is merely one component of a broader strategy to gain economic control over our resources and trade routes. Alexander began to understand the true scope of the crisis they faced. Victoria's treachery was not just a personal betrayal or even a political coup. It was part of an international conspiracy designed to undermine their nation's sovereignty. The evidence we've gathered will expose the traitors within our government, King Edmund continued. But it will also reveal the extent to which foreign powers have infiltrated our institutions. The public reaction could destabilize the government and create the very chaos that Valdora seeks to exploit. Then what do you propose we do? Alexander asked, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling upon his shoulders. We must act decisively but carefully, his father replied. First, we neutralize the immediate threat by confronting Victoria directly and forcing her to abandon her plans. Second, we use the evidence we've gathered to quietly remove the traitors from their positions without creating a public scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation beyond repair. Alexander considered the strategy his father outlined. It was politically astute, but carried significant risks. If they failed to completely neutralize the conspiracy, the remaining conspirators could regroup and launch an even more devastating attack. What guarantee do we have that Victoria will cooperate once she's been exposed? Alexander asked. Her personality suggests she's more likely to double down on her efforts rather than surrender gracefully. King Edmund smiled grimly. That's where the thoroughness of our investigation becomes crucial. Victoria's offshore accounts, her communications with foreign agents, her attempts to bribe government officials, all of this constitutes clear evidence of high treason. The penalty for such crimes is still death in our constitutional framework, though it hasn't been enforced in over a century. The threat was clear, and Alexander understood that Victoria would have no choice but to comply once she fully grasped the consequences of continued resistance. There's something else, King Edmund added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Victoria has been slowly poisoning me. Duhem, Lotoming, Endern. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. What? Small doses of a rare toxin, administered through my daily medications. The king explained matter-of-factly. Our physicians identified it several weeks ago during routine blood work. The symptoms mimic natural aging and illness, which is why her method went undetected for so long. Alexander felt rage building within him, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The woman his father had trusted, had opened his home and heart to, had been systematically murdering him while plotting to steal his throne. Father, why didn't you tell me immediately? We could have had her arrested, because arresting her for attempted murder would have exposed the investigation prematurely. King Edmund interrupted. Besides, once we identified the poison, it became relatively simple to counteract. My health has actually been improving over the past few weeks, though I've been careful to maintain the appearance of continued decline. The king's strategic thinking remained as sharp as ever, even in the face of personal betrayal and mortal danger. Alexander realized that his father had been conducting a complex intelligence operation while literally fighting for his life. When do we confront her? Alexander asked, his voice hard with determination. Tomorrow evening, King Edmund replied. Victoria believes I'm too ill to attend the annual harvest ball, so she's planned to use the event to announce my intention to abdicate due to health concerns. Instead, we'll be presenting our evidence to the assembled nobility and foreign dignitaries. The harvest ball was one of the most important social events of the royal calendar, attended by hundreds of influential figures from across the kingdom and neighboring nations. It would be the perfect venue to expose Victoria's crimes while simultaneously demonstrating the monarchy's strength and unity. What about the broader conspiracy? Alexander asked. The other traitors won't simply disappear once Victoria is dealt with. Sir William Hartley has been working with our security services to prepare simultaneous arrests of all identified conspirators, King Edmund explained. The operation will occur during the ball, ensuring that none of the traitors can warn the others or escape justice. Alexander marveled at the complexity and scope of the operation his father had orchestrated. Every detail had been carefully planned to maximize the chances of success while minimizing the potential for collateral damage. And what of the Valderan Republic? Alexander inquired. They won't simply abandon their plans because their local conspiracy has been exposed. King Edmund's expression grew thoughtful. That, my son, will be your first challenge as king. I intend to abdicate immediately after Victoria's exposure, but not due to illness or incapacity. I'll be stepping down to allow a younger, stronger leader to confront the external threats our nation faces. The revelation that his father intended to abdicate anyway, despite defeating Victoria's conspiracy, caught Alexander off guard. Father, you don't need to. Father, deign to. Yes, I do, King Edmund said firmly. This conspiracy has revealed weaknesses in our government that require fresh leadership to address. You have the energy, the intelligence, and the moral authority necessary to rebuild our institutions and defend against foreign threats. It's time for you to assume the crown you were born to wear. As the evening shadows lengthened outside the dining room windows, Alexander contemplated the enormous responsibility that would soon be his. Tomorrow night would determine not only the fate of Victoria Ashworth and her fellow conspirators, but the future direction of the entire kingdom. The battle for the crown was about to reach its climax, and Alexander understood that victory would require not just exposing the truth, but proving that the monarchy remained strong enough to protect the nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The grand ballroom of Ravenshollow Castle had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing lights across the assembled crowd of nobility, diplomats, and dignitaries who had gathered for the annual harvest ball. Ladies in elegant gowns moved gracefully across the polished marble floors, while gentlemen in formal military dress and ceremonial uniforms engaged in animated conversations about politics, trade, and international affairs. Queen Consort Victoria Ashworth stood at the center of attention, resplendent in a gown of deep sapphire blue that emphasized her striking beauty and regal bearing. To the casual observer, she appeared to be the perfect royal hostess, graciously welcoming guests and ensuring that every detail of the evening proceeded flawlessly. Only those who knew to look for it could detect the tension in her smile and the calculating gleam in her emerald eyes. Prince Alexander observed the scene from the minstrel's gallery above the ballroom, his position allowing him to monitor both Victoria's movements and the strategic positioning of security personnel throughout the crowd. Sir William Hartley stood beside him, occasionally consulting a pocket watch and making subtle hand signals to coordinated teams stationed at various exits. "She's played her role perfectly," Alexander murmured, watching Victoria charm a group of foreign ambassadors. "Even knowing what we know, she's convincing in her performance as the devoted wife and concerned queen. Sociopaths often are," Sir William replied grimly. "The ability to manipulate emotions and project false sincerity is one of their most dangerous weapons. However, that same confidence will work against her when the truth is revealed." Below them, the orchestra began playing the traditional fanfare that preceded formal royal announcements. As planned, Victoria moved toward the raised platform at the far end of the ballroom, preparing to deliver what she believed would be her moment of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "I must ask for your attention regarding a matter of great importance to the crown and the kingdom." Alexander felt his pulse quicken as the moment of confrontation approached. Everything depended on the timing being perfect and the evidence being presented in a way that left no room for doubt or manipulation. "As you know, His Majesty King Edmund has been courageously battling illness for several months," Victoria continued, her voice heavy with manufactured emotion. "It is with great sadness that I must inform you that his condition has deteriorated to the point where I have decided to address the kingdom personally." The voice that interrupted Victoria carried the unmistakable authority of King Edmund himself. Conversations ceased immediately as every eye in the ballroom turned toward the main entrance, where the king appeared flanked by a full ceremonial guard. Gone was the frail, sickly man who had been confined to his quarters for weeks. In his place stood a monarch whose bearing reminded everyone present why he had commanded respect for over 3 decades. Victoria's composure cracked visibly as she stared at her husband in shock and growing fear. The king she had been slowly poisoning, the man she believed was too weak and confused to threaten her plans, was striding purposefully toward the platform with obvious strength and clarity of mind. "Your Majesty," Victoria stammered, attempting to regain her composure. "The physicians said many things," King Edmund replied as he ascended to the platform, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "including the fact that I had been ingesting small amounts of a rare Valderan toxin for several months." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as the implications of the king's words began to sink in. Victoria's face had gone pale, but she maintained her position on the platform, perhaps calculating whether she could still somehow salvage the situation. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled but lacking its previous warmth. "I'm not suggesting anything," King Edmund replied. "I'm stating facts that will be supported by comprehensive evidence." On cue, Prince Alexander descended from the gallery, accompanied by Sir William Hartley and a team of royal security officers. The crowd parted before them as they approached the platform, creating a clear path that emphasized the gravity of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," King Edmund announced, "what I am about to reveal will shock and disturb many of you. However, it is essential that the truth be known, both for the sake of justice and for the security of our nation." Alexander joined his father on the platform, while Sir William distributed packets of evidence to key individuals throughout the ballroom, including foreign ambassadors, parliamentary leaders, and military commanders. The documentation had been carefully prepared to provide irrefutable proof of the conspiracy, while protecting sensitive intelligence sources and methods. Queen Consort Victoria Ashworth has been engaged in treasonous activities designed to undermine the lawful succession to the throne, King Edmund declared. These activities include accepting bribes from the Valderan Republic, attempting to manipulate parliamentary procedures, and conspiracy to commit murder through the systematic administration of poison. Victoria's mask of innocence finally slipped completely as she realized the extent to which her activities had been discovered and documented. "This is preposterous. This is preposterous," she declared, her voice rising with desperation. "I have devoted myself entirely to supporting my husband and serving this kingdom. These accusations are the fabrications of a sick man whose mind has been compromised by the toxin you've been feeding me." King Edmund interrupted calmly. "A toxin that our laboratory analysis has traced directly to sources within the Valdoran Republic. A toxin that was administered through medications you personally prepared and delivered." Sir William stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing the most damning evidence against Victoria. "Your Royal Highness," he addressed the Queen Consort formally, "you are hereby charged with high treason, attempted murder, conspiracy against the crown, and accepting bribes from foreign agents. The evidence against you includes financial records, recorded communications, surveillance photographs, and forensic analysis of the substances used in your attempts to poison His Majesty." The ballroom had fallen into complete silence, except for the rustle of papers as attendees examined the evidence packets. The documentation was overwhelming in its scope and detail, leaving no reasonable doubt about Victoria's guilt. "Furthermore," King Edmund continued, "this investigation has revealed that Queen Consort Victoria was not acting alone. Several individuals within our government and military have been identified as co-conspirators in this plot against the crown. As if choreographed, security teams throughout the ballroom moved simultaneously to apprehend specific individuals who had been identified through the investigation. Chancellor Blackwood was arrested at his table, his face showing resignation rather than surprise. 2 parliamentary members and a military colonel were also taken into custody, their attempts at protest drowned out by the murmurs of shock from other attendees. Victoria looked around desperately as she realized that all of her allies had been identified and were being arrested. The carefully constructed network of corruption and foreign influence that she had spent years building was being systematically dismantled before her eyes. "You cannot prove any of this," Victoria declared, making one final attempt at defiance. "I am protected by my status as Queen Consort, and I demand the right to face these accusations in proper legal proceedings. Your status as Queen Consort ended the moment you committed treason against the crown." Alexander spoke, for the first time since joining his father on the platform. "As for legal proceedings, You will receive a fair trial in accordance with our laws. However, I should inform you that the penalty for high treason remains quite severe in our constitutional framework. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Victoria's eyes darted around the ballroom, as if seeking an escape route, but security personnel had positioned themselves at every exit. Her foreign allies among the diplomatic corps maintained carefully neutral expressions, already calculating how to distance themselves from the exposed conspiracy. There is, however, an alternative, King Edmund announced, his voice carrying a note of mercy that surprised many observers. Confession of your crimes, cooperation in identifying any remaining conspirators, and voluntary exile from the kingdom. In exchange, your life would be spared, though your titles and privileges would be permanently revoked. The offer was more generous than Victoria had any right to expect, and she understood that it represented her only chance for survival. After several moments of tense silence, she slowly nodded her acceptance. I confess to the charges against me, Victoria said quietly, her voice barely audible across the ballroom. I acted against the crown and against the laws of this kingdom. I accept exile as punishment for my crimes. King Edmund nodded solemnly before turning to address the assembled crowd. The immediate threat to the crown has been neutralized, but this incident has revealed vulnerabilities in our government that must be addressed. Therefore, effective immediately, I am abdicating the throne in favor of Prince Alexander, who will assume the crown as King Alexander I. The announcement of abdication, though expected by some, still sent shockwaves through the ballroom. Alexander stepped forward as his father removed the simple gold band that served as the symbol of royal authority and placed it in his son's hands. Long live the king, King Edmund declared. And the traditional response echoed throughout the ballroom as hundreds of voices proclaimed their loyalty to the new monarch. King Alexander accepted the crown with the weight of understanding that his reign would begin during one of the most challenging periods in the kingdom's history. The Valderan conspiracy had been exposed and defeated, but the broader threats to the nation's security and independence remained. In the days that followed, Victoria Ashworth was quietly escorted to the border and banned from ever returning to the kingdom. The trials of her co-conspirators proceeded swiftly, with most receiving lengthy prison sentences rather than execution. The Valderan Republic officially denied any involvement in the conspiracy, but diplomatic relations between the two nations remained strained. King Alexander's first acts as monarch included a comprehensive review of government security procedures, the establishment of new oversight mechanisms to prevent foreign infiltration, and a renewed commitment to the principles of justice and transparency that his mother had embodied. The harvest ball that was meant to mark the beginning of Victoria's triumph instead became the moment when the crown demonstrated its resilience and strength. The monarchy had faced its greatest internal threat in generations, and emerged not weakened, but renewed in its dedication to serving the people and protecting the kingdom's independence. As the weeks passed and the immediate crisis faded into history, King Alexander often reflected on the lessons learned from Victoria's betrayal. The crown was not simply a symbol of authority, but a sacred trust that demanded constant vigilance, unwavering integrity, and the courage to confront any threat to the values and freedoms that defined their nation. The battle for the crown had been won, but King Alexander understood that the true test of his reign would be measured not in moments of crisis, but in the daily decisions that would shape the kingdom's future for generations to come. The crown's justice had been served, and now the work of building a stronger, more secure monarchy could begin.